I'm Robert Thiemann. I'm the founder of Frame, and warm welcome to Frame Live. Today we will be talking again about hospitality spaces, and we will deep dive very deep today with two guests from Copenhagen, from Space Copenhagen actually, to talk about how to complete a project from a distance. I'm talking about Senior Henriksen and Peter Bundgaard. Hi guys, can you start your video? There you are.
Hello.
Welcome, how are you?
Hi Robert, how are you? We're very well, thanks.
Good. I was just saying that you specialize in hospitality spaces and designing hospitality spaces. You designed hotels in London, The Stratford, in New York, 11 Howard. You designed world-class restaurants like Noma in Copenhagen, like Geranium in Copenhagen. You even design furniture, also especially for hospitality spaces, for the likes of Gubi from Denmark and Fredericia. So you guys know a lot of things about hospitality. And today, I would like to hear from you how you approach your design process, how you collaborate with your clients, but also, and this is quite unique, you have been working on high-end projects in Antwerp for, again, a very great chef, Sergio Herman. And then the process was interrupted by Corona, and you couldn't finish the project as you had wished by going to the site. You had to work from a distance. And I would like to share your experiences with our audience to find out what that means and if there are any lessons to be learned going forward. Welcome again.
Thank you.
How do you approach hospitality design? I mean, I've been talking with Natalie from El Equipo Creativo some weeks ago from Barcelona. They also specialize in hospitality spaces. And there you could say that they design spaces to escape in. There's a lot going on and you're projected into a different world. You can say goodbye to your everyday life and enjoy the world you're in at that specific moment. Whereas if you look at the spaces that you design, you seem to be willing to do the opposite. You seem to be willing to create spaces that are here to comfort you, that are here to keep you grounded, to keep you rooted to the earth. There are enveloping spaces with warm materials and a really soft natural color palette. So is that indeed the case? What are you looking for when designing hospitality spaces?
Well, you know, I think first of all, it might be worth noting that we sort of ended up, I think, by doing hospitality because it is a passion of ours. The social context is of being in restaurants, traveling, looking at places that require that you stay at hotels. This special kind of habitation and this special kind of social encounter. And perhaps from our perspective, it's not as much the idea of escapism, but just recognizing that we do have different needs. We have sort of the need to be intimate and be private, but we have just as much the capacity of seeking companionship, to having this curiosity that always seeks an outlet when we're confronted in groups and social gatherings and such. So that whole context, I think, is something we regard as very instrumental and very complementary to the more private notions that we have as individuals. So we don't see it perhaps as a means of escape, but just as a different need that we enjoy very much. And I think that just draws kind of towards this special sort of niche within architecture and design.
Yeah, and I think what is interesting and also has been interesting always, sort of working together, has been, I mean, we know each other back from architecture school, which was a relatively theoretic education in many ways, and somehow we were both sort of drawn to the smaller scale architecture, the scale where people engage, and that has sort of this human layer. We've always been extremely interested in how we sort of cross culture somehow have similar experiences, whether we are young or old, or from one or the other culture, we somehow are able to connect sort of through spaces that have some kind of impact on you. And we've sort of from the very beginning for the past 25 years, sort of trying to filter down some of these mechanisms of how we anchor, how we feel safe in a space, what makes a space sort of both sort of intriguing, but also comforting, and how we can play with that puzzle in many different ways.
If you go out yourselves, if you visit another city or perhaps go out in Copenhagen, are you looking for that same experience?
I think, you know, it's sort of conditioned by your mood a little bit, and one of the things that sort of Signe is mentioning is we're very sort of fascinated by that intuitive relation, that feedback system that sort of connects a space to whoever enters the space. There's something immediate, an immediate kind of response to the architecture and the proportions, the textures, the tactilities. And sort of a little bit depending on your preference and your mood, you kind of course, if you go out eating, you're very interested in what's on the plate, but you're also equally interested in what kind of atmosphere do I need? What kind of context am I seeking? Is it very sort of low key, or is it a little bit more, is there a bit more noise? Is it a little bit more engaging? And try to be quite attentive to that, the psychological profile of whatever it is we're seeking. And I think that we take that into our work as well. It's one of the things that we spend a lot of time sort of debating and conversations about with our clients, how to from a psychological point of view, what is it we want the guest to experience? How do we then secondly try to secure and manifest that into our solutions? So celebrating this sort of intuitive relationship between the space and whoever is inside it is per definition something that we are both, I think, looking for as private persons, but also believe strongly in creating into the way we work and try to solve these cases.
What attracts you in designing for hospitality?
Well, I think there's something, I mean, it has been quite a journey for us. I mean, we've done this for many, many years. And the thing is that I think that we actually promised each other from the very beginning that we would try to stay curious. Because in a way, when we started out, we felt that we very fast would sort of grow old and become boring if we sort of if we just repeated the same formula in different ways, the formula that we had defined somehow. So we sort of seeked from the very beginning a very close dialogue with our clients in hospitality to sort of find a mutual language platform, sort of a design DNA that we could somehow both relate to and find sort of resonance in together, creating this ambition. And I think that has been a huge inspiration for us the whole way through, because even though we might have sort of a natural preference for organic material, let's say, which is probably the only really red thread throughout all our projects, we also want to keep moving and keep curious whenever engaging into a new project. We are very lucky that many of our clients are super creative people in their own right, in their own field, whether that's in food or in fashion or simply from different types of backgrounds, and can bring sort of inspiration to the table that changes that also changes our perception of the experience.
Let's talk about one such client, Sergio Herman. He's a Dutch chef. At a certain moment, he had a restaurant in the Netherlands with 2 Michelin stars. He closed it down. He opened a restaurant in Antwerp called The Jane. And he approached you, I think it was 2 years ago, to design a new restaurant in Antwerp. How did that go? How did this guy find you, and how was your first meeting?
Well, it was actually one of those things. I mean, when we look back at all our projects, the way they sort of suddenly arrive at our front door is always sort of somehow unexpected. In this case, when he did the Jane, it so happens that they, disconnected from our influence, chose a range of our furniture, which a series we did with Fredericia furniture a number of years back. And they were just so very pleased with having those pieces as a part of their concept for the Jane that they asked Fredericia to set up a meeting. They had this new case, and before mentioning too much about it, they just wanted to have a chance to meet us. So they flew up a group, Sergio and his most trusted sort of crew, and we went out and had lunch, and basically didn't talk specifically too much about it. It was one of these get to know you, and I think it sort of goes both ways. It's a way of testing chemistry, basically, to see if you share language, if you share references and aspirations, if you have a natural flow within sort of the conversation, and it very much felt so. It felt very immediate, very easy to connect with Sergio and his people, and we set up a second meeting, and where they gave us much more details about the specifics of this problem or this project, and that was sort of that.
But I think it's also very important to state that whenever you engage in a new project, it's to be honest, there are so many ways you can solve successfully a project, both aesthetically but also functionally. And I think what at the end of the day is one of the most important things to have, like both a process which can actually, where 2 and 2 is more than 4, is when you feel that you have a certain, as Peter mentioned, like a certain chemistry or feeling of actually being able to mold something together, to be able to create something together which is larger than what you could do yourself. And I think that whole feeling of being inspired by each other is one of the more important things to be able to take all the decisions afterwards, and feeling a certain trust in each other, and feeling a trust in sort of the capacity of the team in front of you. And that goes both ways.
I think another aspect, which is certainly something that we put a lot of interest and a lot of passion into, is, and we feel the same with a lot of the chefs, a lot of the hoteliers we work with, is, of course, there's an end goal. We want to open a restaurant, we want to open a hotel, but it also takes time to do so. And a restaurant like this, it takes 2 years out of your lifespan. You dedicate yourself to it. So equally for them, but for us as well, it's sort of also making sure that you're having the time you spend on it in itself is of value. That you, as Sina mentioned, that you learn something from it, that you can discover something, that you can look back at it and not only look at the images or sort of how it looked at the day of the opening, but also remember sort of the process of doing it as something out of quality for us, for being a part of it. So there are more essential things that we sort of try to unfold into our choices when we make them. Realize, I mean, we're working on a project now in Tokyo, which is going to take almost 8 years. It's a lot of out of one lifespan, working life, and it's so important that we feel that it's not just about getting it done. It's also about enjoying the ride and having the opportunity to sort of enrich your knowledge, your capacity to understand other people, the relations we all engage into, and what they mean to us.
It's not about the destination, it's about the journey.
Exactly.
For sure.
So in this case, it's a restaurant right in the center of Antwerp. It is, well, one of Sergio Herman's restaurants, and well, immediately that springs to mind that he has had and still has lots of Michelin stars, so high-end restaurant. When did you first see the location of the restaurant? What sort of location is it?
Well, it's a kind of, I mean, Antwerp is a quite special city. It's fairly small, but it has it sort of has this duality, because it was also one of these cities that were sort of affected by the 20th century. So it has a building mass that sort of is a juxtaposition of a lot of modern buildings from the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s that coincide and are next door neighbors to almost Baroque Renaissance-oriented buildings. And this site is indeed a 60s building that is next door neighbor to a 17th century bank, Baroque building. And a part of the local partners are actually residing, they are fashion people, and they have a wonderful, perhaps the largest and most versatile sort of high-end fashion store in Antwerp called Rützou. And these two buildings are next door neighbors, and actually sort of have a patio space that interlocks the two together. So quite different conditions. And the trick was, how do we create a connection between these two universes? How do we translate that? And how do we also try to secure a connection to Antwerp in itself? One of the learning experiences that differentiate Antwerp from something like Copenhagen is that even though Antwerp is sort of quite famed as a design destination, it does not have the amount of tourist travelers that Copenhagen might have or London have. So the audience is very much the city itself. It's very much those who live in Antwerp that were the profile audience for this restaurant. And that sort of made us think that we need to see if we, in our research, can find valid readings of a historic sort of element, so crafted local cultural sort of momentums that we can filter into this experience. And
did you get a specific brief, or?
Well, we didn't actually. I think we were shown this. I mean, really extraordinary space. The space is extraordinary because, as Peter mentioned, it's a modern space, sort of linked to this 17th century Baroque building next door, but it almost have like a church-like proportions. It's very sort of when you enter, very slim, sort of. But extremely tall space, industrial in its sort of ambience, like with brick walls, sort of soft but dusted brick walls and metal structures. But it still has this almost sacral feeling of a church because of the proportions. And then it opens up when you sort of passes through it, and you enter the sort of the part of the space which became the sort of the restaurant connecting to two courtyards. And that space in itself was just incredible walking into when it was just empty. So it somehow brought us something, that feeling of the hybrid with the connecting space, and the feeling of the old city, but at the same time being extremely modern. And I think they wanted to create a social scene. They wanted a sexy restaurant where full of vibrance and sort of being able to enjoy from lunch to late drinks and everything in between. They wanted like this really cozy feel of a brasserie, which you find like in the old Paris or old London kind of atmosphere.
I think though I mean, one of the things we debate a lot is that there's so much nostalgia because we also connect with with reference a lot, and everybody does and feels a certain comfort in recognition. But one of the things that defines Sergio and his team is that even though they're looking into their roots for the origin and sort of the argumentation for their palate in their gastronomy, they also want reinvention. They want to move on. So it's in recognition of a tradition, but it's also the ambition to create something new. And I think it's the same with this space, sort of drawing upon certain readings of nostalgia, certain readings of historic reference, but trying to weave it together so it becomes not a replica of something, but something where you can see the different influences, but weave together quite differently, and hopefully bringing, an updated version of a Flemish brasserie with his food, but in a very sort of modern context.
But I think our references were never of an aesthetic character. It was more like from an atmosphere kind of reference. And what we sort of used as our anchor was sort of a reading of these. I mean, because we always had this sort of huge admiration for the big Flemish masters in painting, and for us, we could sincerely sort of use a part of this color palette, but also sort of the historic reference, but also the atmosphere and some of these paintings that we really felt somehow felt relevant in this extremely beautiful space. And at the same time, we wanted to sort of weave it with our sort of perception of very local materials that we even love to use outside sort of the Flemish borders, but simply use the linen, the bluestones, the sort of the different sort of textures and crafts that they are extremely good at, and interpret that into a new setting.
So let's have a look at some of your sketches and, let's say, mood boards.
Yeah.
Because that will make things much easier. So we're talking about a restaurant that is called Le Pristine.
Yes.
And this is
where we started.
Sorry?
Yeah, this is where we started.
Yes, this is about colors and nuances. Yes. So we see these Flemish paintings, and what do you take from them?
Well, there are several things to take from them. There's a certain color palette where it sort of goes from very subdued colors, very tones of gray and dark as backgrounds, and then there is this splash of something slightly more saturated. But something that's also quite interesting is, especially if you look into the paintings, the motifs of something like Bruegel, you will very often see that it's narratives that are sort of depicting ordinary life. And Sergio wanted to also say the first encounter with this restaurant is a large oven. It's something where you, as the very first sort of encounter with it, with all your senses, your smell, your sense of proportion, your visual, you're in contact with bread being made. And sort of this honesty about the product is also something that relates not only in terms of color and texture into this tradition of painting, but also that it depicts sort of quite ordinary situations. So it has sort of a duality, both relating to a narrative, but also as a background for a choice of colors and materials and tactility. So it sort of serves as something that we can use as we maneuver from an idea into a concept, and we kind of go back to this as a way of saying, does this fit, does this not fit? So we thought it quite relevant, and it was something that to that region connects quite honestly.
But I think they speak a lot about sort of that sense of touching, of intimacy, of playing with contrast, sort of from sort of the light that comes in from the courtyards into the darker spaces, the nature that somehow relates to the sort of more manufactured or manicured reality. So there's some sort of alluring intimacy in these images that we also feel sort of in a more sort of subtle way. We sort of try to engage with that power and see if we could translate it somehow into some of the sort of spatial features of the project.
Mm-hmm. So you spoke about connecting, referencing local context, local history, local materials and craftsmanship. Mm-hmm. This is all about that. This is all about crafts and tactility. What do we see here?
Well, here we see a variety of materials that are, if you look into the previous slide and you look into these images, you'll actually find a lot of these materials somehow being embedded. So you see the Belgian bluestone is a very sort of is a very common stone used both up through the last 300-400 years. You use it especially for outdoor spaces. And you use it especially for entry and passage spaces, and in a lot of different sort of articulations from different patterns, different sizes. But it is also something that connects to the region, a local stone, so to speak. We're sort of fascinated by using a material, using a stone that suggests that kind of relation. And then the fabrics as such are natural dyes of Belgian linen, which is something the region also has a huge tradition for. And these fabrics, if you look isolated of it, it's sort of reminiscent of a process, a kind of craft, a kind of way of processing textile that has almost gone unchanged for hundreds of years, but still feel very humble, very sort of comforting and easy, and very soft to the touch, but still sort of with a sense of tactility and rawness in it. So I think that's sort of the next derivative of the paintings, is to identify these colors and materials.
But I think it's important to say that at this stage of the project, we don't know exactly where it's going yet. I mean, well, now we know how it ended, but when we collected this sort of, it's also to us to sort of familiarize ourselves with the project and sort of the ways that we sort of the tools that we find interesting. And for instance, the sort of the linen story became a completely different linen story than we showed in the previous image. But it actually connects more to the images you show now about the big bare walls, and you have these sort of extremely monumental, beautiful, tactile walls that we ended up combining with huge sort of tapestries that we did ourselves in the office during the Corona time, applying on the walls, both to sort of somehow both to frame the walls, but also to frame the linen, and also from sort of a functional acoustic sort of point of view, they somehow fulfill a reason to be there. So it's we just love these sort of fragments that we have sort of mostly, I think maybe one of them is from one of our projects, but none of the other images here on this page are actually restaurants. So it's more about sort of looking into how to create these sort of dualities of compositions on the walls, where we sort of both celebrate the tactility in the industrial field, and then at the same time we do something crazily sort of refined and crafted that we sort of layer on top of this, and we sort of love to use these juxtapositions of elements, because we feel that each of them sort of grows stronger by doing that.
When we looked at the building for the first time, the thing about the 60s, the building from the 60s was undergoing change. So the floors above were transformed into residential units. And for this purpose, there was quite a severe degree of structural change. And when we saw the space first, it was sort of waiting to be transformed to something. And everything they had done to the structure was really sort of uncoordinated and exposed. But there was a certain honesty in that transformation, the story of things that once were created for something, losing its purpose and then redefining itself. And the rawness of those walls, that we chose to keep them instead of sort of outlining and covering it up, was a way to kind of, again, transmit that honesty, that quirkiness of a new staircase, seeing the underside of it, the structural beams that were heavy because the distribution of the floors were different. There was something interesting in having all these insertions become sort of quite opposite visual elements, all contributing to a quite diverse story, very eclectic in its sort of expression. And they sort of, they work very well together with this idea of using the historic elements that Sine spoke of earlier. So the composition is not a streamlined project. It has a lot of different sort of diverting elements, both in the architecture, but ultimately also in the design.
So you speak about, let's say, exposing historical layers of that building and
yes.
Not touching existing walls and elements. But here we are looking at elements that you bring into that space, which are a bit more contemporary, of course, but I wouldn't say hyper modern. So how do you select this furniture, for instance? When does it work for you?
Yeah, well, that's a very long puzzle, and it also ended up slightly different than shown here. But actually, I think what this page shows very clearly is this need for sort of something that has this very sort of modern, forward-thinking touch to it, and then at the same time that it has sort of this sort of more comfortable layer that sort of anchors you in the space and allows yourself to sort of fill out some of the gaps when experiencing the sort of not just the space, but the whole sort of story from entering to sort of engaging, and we like somehow to find these opposites. It's a little like sort of masculine and feminine somehow sort of equals out in a beautiful manner in yin and yang. We very often work with these dualities, whether that's dark that meets light, or raw that meets more refined, or masculine touch that meets something which is a little more sensual or feminine to the approach.
So you're very precise with selecting textures, materials, colors, objects, furniture. Let's have a look at how all of this is implemented in the actual space, how you envisioned it to be in the end. So where goes which material? What are we looking at here? Is that an open kitchen?
Well, this is sort of your entry point. So this is an early sort of conceptual idea of your point of entry, and this is, you're entering into a very narrow space, and to the left you have fragments of the old wall that sort of is partly 60s, part 17th century. And to the right, you have a concrete field. That's a new insertion of a staircase to the above floors. And these black elements are structural black steel. So there's a base palette of something that already defined the area. And at the far back, you have a gigantic structural glazing element to the outdoor. So you also have everything you see towards that. There's abundance of light at the end of the tunnel. It also means that everything you look through that, everything will be sort of defined by its profile. But this very first image sort of shows you entering the bakery part, and you're almost entering into the bakery. Your first step in is into a work zone, into a steel oven encased into the wall, new piece of wall. But you're sort of engaging directly into what in other projects would be the back of house experience. So you're sort of entering in reverse somehow.
And here it's I think a lateral view of the image that we just saw.
Yeah, and this is also a good example of, I mean, something that never really made it to the final project, but we like the idea of having these sort of a little bit, I mean, I think, or maybe it just translated into becoming something different in the end, but this big box, we imagine to have sort of its own narrative, sort of its own identity with this sort of extreme, huge pattern, which was sort of an exploded, sort of reference to also some sort of historical features, sort of interpreted into a new, in a new manner.
You could say it was what we spoke about. It was that there's a different tradition also in that region, the style movement, that way of abstract composition that belonged to sort of the 30s and the 40s, and this was sort of a way of saying let's do a separate object that becomes an object within the space that sort of looks at that specific period. I think what happened is for a lot of reasons, we were forced to make, at the end of the day, some different choices as to the articulation of that box. But to the right of it, you can see sort of the bakery, and you can see the first part, that narrow part of the restaurant experience, is for a faster transition. It's where you go and buy bread, you can buy resources, take with you. You can also go and have a sandwich, you can have a pizza, you can have a typology of food that is sort of more, is faster, is less formal.
But I think it's also, I mean, at this stage, it's very early studies of how to lay out the space.
So when did you make this study? I mean, as a reference to
Well, this was in the very beginning.
This was in the.
That was early 2019.
Yeah, that must have been like more than a year before it opened. So it's I think it's our way of starting sort of the communication, the puzzle, sort of laying down a few of the pieces of that puzzle and saying, okay, let's discuss, you know, how do we go about it functionally? How is the flow in the, I mean, it's a huge space. There's a lot of interaction between the two spaces, the bar, the restaurant, the bakery, and then I mean, there's from the guest perspective, there's from the sort of the people who sort of manage the space, and the whole operation needs to sort of fill into this conversation at this point. But I think also showing here that we never forget that when we sort of have finalized the architecture and the design, there will be a layer coming on top of this. There'll be a lot of food, a lot of glasses, a lot of textures from napkins, ceramics, people, uniforms, groceries, a lot of food and vegetable, and all the guests will come with their sort of, I mean, so you constantly try to balance out the space so that it doesn't become a mess in the end, basically. It's like designing a fashion store and forgetting about the collection that will always sit in it, summer or winter. It should still fulfill the purpose of framing that in a beautiful manner somehow.
I would
I
like
think one of the interesting things about this project was that once we started having very heavy conversations about what the restaurant crew actually needed to operate this space, we became very sort of aware that the space was actually not big enough. We had nowhere to put the back of house function. So what you see in this image is a bar, but above the bar, there's sort of a balcony leading up to the restaurant. But that whole structure is actually, we had to create kind of a building within the building. So everything above the kitchen and above the bar is actually a structural insertion housing back of house areas. Now, the trick was not to kind of reveal that to the customer, but to facilitate it to the operation so they can run it the way they would. But it sort of, it kind of grew and became quite complex to coordinate all of this.
And here you see something that is new until now. You see a hypermodern element. This, I think it's artificial resin, the pink element, and there's a light as well on the balcony that seems to speak a totally different language.
From the very beginning, we sort of, we love the idea of engaging and interacting with some local artists, and we were quite familiar with an amazing artist, Sabine Marcelis, who we wanted to create, who works in resin and who works in different very beautiful sort of colored tones of resin. And from the very beginning, we sort of wished, at this point, we didn't know whether that we would succeed in that or not. But we sort of laid out the bar so that that could be sort of an obvious component for her to sort of inhabit in the space as sort of this sort of beautiful little surprising fragment sort of sitting in the space as its own little entity. And the same, we didn't know exactly who that would be, but exactly sort of we're showing around on walls and on different sort of in different scales, objects or art pieces that we imagine that we would at a later point be able to activate by some conversations with local artists. And that was sort of at the end sort of fueled very, very much by our client and the whole team, who are like sort of super well connected and very interested in art and sort of engaged in these conversations for us as well during the last period.
So you present this to the clients, and probably the client embraces most of it. Did you need to make any alterations?
Well, yes, it's a kind of it's a conversation, but very early on, it was very clear that the notion of inviting curating a palette of artists that would make their own contribution was a clear strategy from very early on. We were, I mean, Sabine was perhaps the first one identified. We've always been big fans of Sabine. We're working with her on another project, but it also turns out the client knew her very well. So the bar and sort of the idea for the bar, also because it's a functional element more than just an artistic piece, that became defined very early on. The other artworks were more suggestive to locations, identifying that certain locations have the potential for housing an artwork. But then working with artists, you have to respect their freedom. So you write a brief, you say, this is the place, we need something here. What could you bring to the palette? So it's also being very open-ended and curious as to what someone else with their own talents and their own visions could bring into this. And that has been a very fulfilling and very interesting process to engage in on a separate note.
So you agree on, let's say, the palettes, the materials, bringing in some local artists with a rather open brief, and then construction begins. And probably that has begun in the summer of 2019. And construction in this case means lots of installations and making the building actually ready for your interventions. And these interventions, they were beginning to take place in the beginning of this year, and then Corona hits. And I'm just curious what happened then, because at the moment you needed to complete this project, which is so detailed and which is so outspoken when it comes to materialization and detailing. You have to do it from afar. You can't go there. You have to work in a remote way.
Well, first of all, the whole project was due to the situation was delayed because part of the assigned contractor was Dutch, and they were simply not able to cross the border for almost 2 months. So the whole process came to a complete standby for a while. I think working remotely for us is something that we over the past decade have become very familiar with. We work in a lot of locations, so we're kind of forced to put our faith and our trust in our means of communication, but also with those with whom we work, that they are capable of fleshing out problems if such occur, having the sensibility to sense when we need to engage and make a decision that they cannot take. But in this case, it's true, construction started much earlier, and like all projects, 80% of the construction is not the finishing layer. It's all the sort of the structural installation parts, and in this case, not being able to be on site was definitely a little bit nerve-wracking, because we kind of put this together saying that a lot of these things are also depending on the quality of the work, the exact execution of those who are actually doing it. So being able to be there once in a while to comment and to give advice, or maybe to change position to certain solutions was very, very difficult.
But I think also, as Peter mentioned, I think this was actually sort of sincerely where our sort of philosophy of creating some mutual trust from the very beginning in a project, which has not been sort of originally due to Corona, but that came in really handy because we somehow trusted a lot in our client, and also that we somehow felt a very sort of mutual goal. But we definitely have also faced during this period of time that coordination issues, etc., can be sort of solved in a Zoom call, but the building site visit is extremely difficult to feel 100% secure about from a FaceTime video or from imagery, because you simply can't judge sort of as Peter said, you can't judge that sort of level of finishing from a photo or from a video call. There's just like no way. So you kind of have to cross your fingers to a certain degree. And it was very frustrating for us because we have put a lot of effort into this project, and it feels like a baby you're giving birth to, and it feels like that you somehow that so many things you depend on somebody else's choices.
But I think the chemistry part is not only with the client. It's also, there's no doubt that when we work with people on the element of execution, carpenters, blacksmiths, contractors of varied degrees, the chemistry is equally important. It's also saying some things, if you feel it's a qualified person who can make choices, who can evaluate what the right thing to do if something unexpected occurs, and it always does when you build. I mean, building something is at best an approximation, so there's always X number of things that go different than you thought they were. So also having, the feel that whoever is building this is skilled in their own right, has the right tools to make the right choice. And there's something that both makes you feel good, but also quite proud about your ability to communicate if you also allow people to make choices. And then you're back to, that also brings more focus on, you need to work with people who you trust. You need to work with people who you feel are talented, who can interpret your message and your work into reality in a way that you feel, even if it's slightly different from your intent, it's a qualified version of it. And this has been very much the case with this. Also, something like the light, turning the light, controlling the light to create the atmosphere is very, very difficult to do without actually being there. So unless you have someone, a light consultant that understands what it is you want to achieve, it's almost impossible.
So did you have that light consultant in this case?
Yes, we did. Fortunately, we did. But also, as Sina says, our client in their own right are very skilled restaurateurs and are fortunately also very capable of having a strong opinion and a strong sense of how it should be.
So it was all about trusting the client, trusting the contractors, trusting the artists, and letting go of control. Here we are looking at the end result. Have you actually been here since it opened, the restaurant?
Well, we went there 2 weeks before it opened.
Where it looked like a mess.
Where I mean, 2 weeks before anything opens in our world is always an insane mess. We feel that with sort of our 20 years of experience, we can see through most of it, but a lot of it you are kind of still crossing your fingers that it'll turn out.
It was a promising mess.
It felt promising, but for instance, for a place like this, the lighting is such an important component, and the lighting is always the last thing to adjust, because you can only adjust it when everything is in place and when all the curtains are put up, and they are not put up before last minute. So many sort of things you do sort of the last 2 days, and that's where everything falls into place. And then we've only seen the images.
Yeah, unfortunately, we've neither been there nor tried the food, so we still have certainly an experience. Yeah. Well, this is a good example. This is sort of the box we saw before, and it transformed into this beautiful piece of artwork, but in a completely different texture. Originally, we had it sort of envisioned as an illuminant square, and then it transformed into becoming a darkened brass metal structure. For different reasons, it became the inside of it is a back of house area, and it couldn't have the transparencies and stuff. Yeah, so there's a lot of changes along the way. But we have to say we're pretty happy with the way that we hear people use it. So we certainly still really much look forward to actually going and seeing the.
So these changes, did they take place with you in the know, or did the contractor or the client make the changes?
No. I mean, we are always sort of asked, which is of course nice, and again based on the mutual trust. But again, it's so many things are much easier to judge when you are standing on site judging. So I would say that we have drawn a lot on our experience, and very happy that this was not our first project, but also that it was such a skilled client, and somehow you always get a little bit sort of warm inside when you see people starting using it. It has this sort of feel that that it somehow becomes alive it sort of breathes, and that's a very fulfilling feeling when you've been working on something for a very long time.
You speak about experience, having experience. So that made you fit to complete this project. What kind of experience could you use in this regard? I mean, you have been talking about completing projects remotely more often. So what kind of experience taught you that this would be all right in the end?
Well, first of all, I mean, from doing restaurants, we know the end goal is to make sure that the guest has a very fluid experience. But to do that, you have to know quite a lot about what the operational side of the restaurant actually needs to facilitate that sensation of seamlessness in the experience. So I think from our side, we've had the benefit of working with a variety of high-level chefs, being sort of over and over a lot of the routines from the staff side, from the kitchen side, from the back of house side, having quite deep knowledge about what it actually takes to create that kind of enriched experience as a guest. And not being there, you're certainly drawing on that palette. Sort of you already know that a problem might occur before it occurs, and that allows you to already take your safe measures to so it doesn't become a problem, that it just becomes something solvable, that you can act before it's too late. And so that sort of that skill set, I think, is something that there's only one way of doing it. It's just by working a lot. Sort of the benefits of having done it before, as Sinise mentioned earlier, sort of really falls into place when you're all of a sudden you're kind of amputated in terms of your ability to be there.
So this is the last image we'll be showing of the project, and it shows this pink bar made of resin, and the light and the back designed by Sabine Marcellus. Personally, I think it's a great juxtaposition of the old and the new in this case, of something historical, something old, and something really, really new. You have been speaking about trusting your clients, trusting contractors. In fact, you created a language for this project together with your client. In effect, you are co-creating this project with the people you have been working with. Is that a right thing to say?
Absolutely, and I think it was not necessarily intended when we started out, but we actually when we got into the the flesh of the project, we suddenly felt that sort of creating this collage, that collage felt suddenly as the right word to use about the way that we have been working with this project. Also because it's relatively big, sort of from a scale perspective, it really felt like we could create this composition of experiences alongside with the ideas also from our client, who in this case was a range of people skilled in different directions. So it definitely feels like it's been a hybrid a way of working, and been extremely inspiring for us also, and it feels like it kind of it feels like a very mature way of working, to be honest, because it somehow is opening for also new ways of thinking, and it has an openness to it that I feel that we were ready for at this point, and might not have been ready for at an earlier stage in our career.
But as you said, we're not looking to create monuments. We're looking to create transformation. We're looking to create experience that is sort of the distillation of everyone involved, that everyone has a qualified voice, and we see our role not as much as sort of creating, you know, manifestations, more as being those who transform all these insights into something that looks to engage with whoever uses it, that it gets its many facets out of these sort of distillations of qualified opinions. And there's something very open-ended, something very generous about it. And also from our side, we ourselves feel enriched by engaging into this collective pool of energy and willingness to invest in the future and to bring experience to whoever enters the space.
So in effect, this experience didn't really bring you new insights because you were already working in this way. It just brought it a little bit further.
It does, and it does create those specifics, because I think we did establish a very tight, very close relationship with Sergio and his team. Their knowledge and their way of interpreting their creativity becomes now a part of our memory. It becomes a part of our own reference when we move on. And there's no doubt that this experience sort of sinks into the fabric of our mythology, our processing, also moving forward. So it does more than just become a space. It also becomes an inner space, a way of navigating towards new horizons, where you take the process of the journey of this project with you further on.
Thank you, Senior. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for sharing your experiences. Thank you for deep diving into this great project. And I wish you the best of luck when visiting it.
We'll let you know. Maybe you can join.
It will be an experience that is as good as it looks. It looks stunning. So yeah, I'm looking forward to getting your first-hand experiences.
You'll be the first to know.
Maybe I will beat you to it because I'm in Amsterdam.
You're at a geographic advantage.
Anyway, thank you very much for being with us. Tomorrow we will have another session about a completely different subject. It will be about making the home greener. How can we embrace nature to bring more health, well-being, and sustainability to the home? And that will be a session that we have organized together with IKEA in the context of Dutch Design Week. Tomorrow, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, another Frame Live about the wilderness inside, intertwining nature with the modern home. Sina and Peter, thanks again for being with us. You in the audience, thank you for watching.
Bye, Robert.
See you soon again. Bye-bye.
Bye.